And I would like to acknowledge that we are gathered here today on traditional Treaty 6 territory and Métis homeland. And I'm very honored to welcome Elder Will Campbell. Elder Campbell has joined us before, once as a presenter as well. Elder Campbell works with Native Counseling Services of Alberta, and in this role, he's often involved with foster families, participating in family circles to help find placements and to ensure children receive the supports they require. Elder Campbell has also served as a board member for the Family Permanency Planning Committee. Through his work, Elder Campbell always strives to make change in a good way so that families and communities will grow stronger and become more supportive, especially during times of crisis. He works passionately to ensure that Indigenous people have a voice in this change. So I would like to invite Elder Campbell to open our meeting with a prayer and a few words.
I want to thank you all for being here today, and to also thank you for the work that you're doing. You know, sometimes we don't stop and take that time to think about, you know, what we are doing and what we need to do and the changes that need to come about. I grew up in foster care, and the time that I was in the 50s, a lot has changed, you know, and it's changed for the better. But like everything, there's room to improve. There's always room to improve. And if we take the time to hear each other and to work with the families and the communities out there, I think the results in the future will look a lot better for our people. So I want to thank you for the work that you do and for having me here this morning. I appreciate it. So I'll ask you to stand and we'll give thanks. Great Spirit, I give thanks for the work that has taken place in this circle, for the people that have gathered here, and for the courage so that it takes sometimes to take those steps towards the good things that need to be done, for taking time to think about our people and to help those that are less fortunate, to ask for prayers for the ones without food and without shelter, the ones that are lost out there on the streets with drugs and alcohol. I say a prayer for the little ones, the ones that are with us now and the ones that are still to come, that we prepare a place of good health and happiness for them. I give thanks to Mother Earth for everything that's on her, comes from her. For the four-legged, the two-legged, the winged creatures, those that live on the ground and swim in the water. And I say a prayer for those that are sick in the hospitals. And I pray that you take their pain, their hurt, their sickness, and you put it where it won't hurt them anymore. So I give thanks to each and every one who is here, and I ask that for those who've traveled a distance and are away from their families, that you watch over their families and take care of them till they return. And for the work that is being done, I ask Tankashala that you give direction and that you help everyone here. And with that, I give thank you. Nahomi Takias. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Elder Campbell. And I'd also like to welcome panel members who are joining us via Zoom video streaming and teleconference. And at this point, I would like to go around the room and have everybody introduce themselves. And just a reminder to please always speak directly into your mic. Beginning with Graham on my left.
I'm Graham Such. I'm the MLA for Calgary Shaw.
David Swan. Good morning, Calgary Mountain View.
Good morning, Bruce McLaurin, University of Calgary.
Good morning, Peter Choate from Mount Royal University.
Good morning, Patty Labucan Benson with Native Counseling Services of Alberta.
Good morning, Tyler White, Siksika Nation.
Good morning, Rick McIver, MLA for Calgary Hayes.
Good morning, Nicole Goring, MLA for Edmonton Castle Downs.
Hello, Cameron Westhead, MLA for Banff Cochrane.
Good morning, Maria Fitzpatrick, MLA for Lethbridge East.
And on the phone? Anyone? Not so far. All right. And I'm Debbie Jabbour. I'm the MLA for Peace River and chair of the panel. And normally committees in this room have Hansard operating the mics, but we don't have that system today, so everybody will have to turn their own microphone on and off. And only 3 can be on live at the same time, so always turn it off when you're finished speaking. Thanks for that reminder. So as always, we welcome and encourage the public to attend and observe our panel meetings. The meeting will be audio live streamed to the panel website, childinterventionpanel.alberta.ca, with the exception of any portions of the meeting that go in camera. We ask people joining us today who wish to provide input on what the panel is discussing to please complete the panel submission form handed out today, or complete the Phase 2 online discussion guide, which is posted on the panel website. You can also send an email to cipanel.questions@gov.ab.ca from the laptops outside this room or from another location. At our last meeting, we had the pleasure of receiving a presentation from our panel members, Dr. Patty Laboucan-Benson, on historical trauma and the impacts of colonization on Indigenous peoples and communities, and Tyler White, who provided the context for our meeting with the First Nations chiefs from Treaty 6, 7, and 8. In the afternoon, we were hosted by Amisquatchie Academy, where we held our first community conversations, and we're very honored to hear from members of the public who came and shared their stories with us. Many of them were very personal, and we greatly appreciated that opportunity. Today, we will hear from our panel member, Dr. Patty Laboucan-Benson, on family-centered practice, model healing, restorative practice, and reconciliation. Then the rest of the day, we will hear from non-governmental organizations, including the Métis Nation of Alberta, the Council of Quality Assurance, the Child and Youth Advocate, Align, Association of Community Services, child advocacy centers, including the Sheldon Kennedy Child Advocate Center and Zebra Child Protection Center, Métis Child and Family Services, and the Alberta College of Social Workers. And then we will finish our day with a discussion of our next meeting agenda. So, moving on, I would like to, yes, Heather, sorry, Nicole.
Sorry, Madam Chair, I just wanted to indicate that MLA Heather Sweet is also on the line. She's indicated that she can hear us, but we can't hear her, and my understanding is that sound is working on that right now.
Sounds good. Welcome, Heather. Hopefully we'll be able to hear from you soon. All right, so I'd like to invite Dr. Patty Laboucan-Benson to proceed with her presentation.
Good morning. Just to start out, I wanted to thank Will for his prayer this morning and for the smudge that we had. It was very grounding this morning. So, yesterday, for everybody that was here, this is where I left you. And we talked about historic trauma, and my goal yesterday was to build an understanding as quickly as I could about what is historic trauma-informed behavior. And so how can we understand our clients in very meaningful ways? And the slide up here right now, I just kind of brought us back to that what we are working with from a family and community perspective is the eroded capacity of individuals, families, and communities to be in control of their own lives and determine their own identity. We're talking about the breakdown of family relationships. We're talking about deep shame that many Indigenous people still have of their identity and lack of meaningful connection to Canadian society and law. We're talking about a long-standing distrust of the criminal and family justice systems, a struggle to understand complexity of these systems, to navigate through them, and that many Indigenous people that we work with feel hopeless, helpless, and powerless in the face of issues with the family and criminal justice system. So that's where we left off yesterday. And I want to take a little bit of time, and there will be time for discussion afterwards. I won't take the whole half hour, to talk about building family and community resilience, children intervention services, healing can all be the same thing. These can be the same process. And what I'd like to do is build a model today to talk about what I believe, and Native Counseling Services of Alberta believes, the 3 principles in doing this healing are. And the first principle, if you remember, there's that tangled spiral. The first principle of healing and restorative practice is reclaiming an interconnected worldview. So, for example, in programs that we run, we talk about Wahkotuan. We talk about those rules of relationships. We we work very hard to bring elders into our programs, have them guide our processes, and build this understanding of a sense of ethics, morals, rules, responsibilities. The other thing about this spiral is when the spiral is whole and healthy and beautiful, each of us can locate ourselves in the spiral. And Indigenous children, for example, can locate themselves in the spiral, understand their relationships with the people and living beings around them. That gives them a sense of belonging, deep belonging, and a responsibility to all of these relationships as well. And so in building back this spiral, in reclaiming our Wahkotuan, we are essentially building our sense of belonging into this system of all living beings. And so it is about positive identity. The second principle is about reconciliation of damaged relationships. And so all the way up and down that spiral, from the individual, the family, the nation, the natural world, and the spirit world, there are relationships that have to be reconciled that have been damaged through colonization. The environmental movement, for example, the water keepers, they are looking at reclaiming the relationship with the environment. Would be one movement. Certainly there is a role for our elected officials in the nation-to-nation work that has to be done. Absolutely. In the middle of that spiral, it is nation-to-nation work. But reconciliation also needs to happen around all of the community-based organizations amongst ourselves, so that we are really interconnected and we can help our clients get best possible services and keep them moving forward. It's also about reconciliation of damaged family relationships that have been, and we heard about people who have been adopted out in the 60s scoop looking for their biological families. That is an important part of reconciliation. For some people, the reconciliation is completely internal, reconciling myself with my Indigenous identity. That was part of my healing journey. For some people, it's reconciling their relationship with the Creator that was damaged through the residential school experience. So all the way up and down that spiral, reconciliation needs to occur. The third principle is self-determination. I have not ever seen one program that has been created that is successful and has good outcomes that had somebody from the outside riding in on a white horse and saving Indigenous people. That model has never worked. For 150 years, that's never worked. 200 and some years. The best programs out there come from community, mobilize community values, community understandings, philosophy, and they're always done in excellent partnerships with government and allies. Those are absolutely necessary. So, if I was to offer a model, this is the work that my organization, this is how we pattern every program. This is what we think of ourselves doing, whether we're working with people who are in jail, whether we're working with families who are requiring our services, whether we're doing public legal education training. Our goal is reconciliation, building our interconnectedness, and self-determination. So from that perspective, I wanted to give you an example of what that might look like. So NCSA has this family reconciliation program, and we assist families throughout the child intervention process. And it's a circle-based program, and I don't have time to talk about why the circle. Circle teachings are incredibly important, and they are, for many people, the basis of good restorative practice. So these circles enable families, caseworkers, and other professionals to come together to talk to each other in a good way about the safety and well-being of children. And the kinds of circles that we provide are reconciliation circles, where we're bringing people together when families are fighting or they're completely disconnected, they don't know each other, and we are doing reconciliation work. We do safety planning circles, family enhancement circles, child placement circles, which used to be known as FGC, but we are really trying to use words that are meaningful to us and what we are trying to accomplish. And circles that we call Pamatsuan circles. So these are for youth aging out of care and helping them to connect to meaningful people in communities. So those are the circles, and this is how we work those principles. So in the first principle of reclaiming an interconnected worldview, we have impartial facilitators ensuring everyone is heard and guide the conversation to build relationships amongst the participants that are respectful, caring, and honest. So they're trained in an Indigenous peacemaker model, and they follow the Wahkotuan teachings. And the elders are involved in the circles, they guide the facilitators, they guide our work, and they keep positive, respectful tones in the circle. So that's that whole idea of reclaiming this interconnected worldview. The second principle, which is the reconciliation of relationships. So the circle focuses on the needs of children and to maintain, strengthen, and build connections to the child's family, culture, and community. And so these circles include family members, anybody who feels like they're a family member, wants to care for the child, caseworkers, and other professionals who offer resources and support to the family. And the third principle of self-determined solution is this: the goal of the circle is to draw on the knowledge, skills, and strength of the individuals and families in that circle to listen to each other and develop plans for the safety and well-being of children and youth. So we believe that everything we need to heal exists within ourselves and within our culture. We deeply believe that. We believe the role of circle process is to help people understand what is inside of them and bring aspects of culture so that they know they have the power to make change for themselves. That is the goal, the actual foundation of restorative practice. And so if we look at community-based healing programs, I've done cost benefits analysis of 2 programs across Canada, and I want to talk about them because they're long-standing, they do very good work, and they save us money. So the very first one we did was in 1999. The report came out in 2001, and it was at the Hollowater First Nations. And what they did is they said they had a real issue in their community with sexual abuse. They're well documented. You can Google Hollowater and see good program information. And they decided, there was a group of women in the community who decided they wanted to take responsibility for this. They wanted to do community-based healing. They didn't want to keep sending men to jail just to come back not healed, sometimes worse, and this problem was perpetuating their community. They wanted to heal the pain experienced by all parties in sexual abuse. And they wanted to minimize the family disruption, provide a safe space for the victims. It was about community safety, and support the non-offending family members, and encourage the victimizer to accept public responsibility for his or her behavior. So when a disclosure would come in, they would send one group out to the victim and the victim's family, and they would send another team out to the victimizer and the victimizer's family. And they would work in restorative practice in circles with both sides to the point where eventually the goal was to have the offender sit in a large circle with the whole community, take responsibility for his or her actions, talk about what happened to him or her as a child and where this behavior came from. And then every single member of the community that was present would have a chance to speak. And this process takes 2 to 5 years, and it's very intensive, but it has the power to really heal community. And so, over a 10-year period that we were looking at, up until 2001, there's 108 victimizers that went through the program, and 2 reoffended. Now, I don't know if those were 2 people who had sexually offended, whether they were the reoffenders, because they work with primarily sex offenders, but they also work with people. For example, there was somebody who had committed a homicide. There were some people who did break and enter, so there was a range. They estimated they had worked with 400 to 500 victims that had been involved in the healing process. And it was accurate to say the entire community benefited from this program meant to heal sex offenders. The victimizers' crimes are primarily sexual offenses, like I said, and the staff estimated 60% of their time is spent in the victimizer services, 30% in services to victims and families, and 10% in community development. So this is what they said. The community said the value-added benefits were amazing. It wasn't just about talking about and dealing with sexual abuse is not taboo anymore, and the wall of silence crumbled. Alcohol misuse has decreased significantly in the community. They said that one disclosure could lead to 3 or 4 other people coming forward, which is positive. The secrecy in the community was lifting. People were talking about the issue. And children were being taught to respect others in both the nuclear and extended family context, increased community ownership of problems and being able to develop solutions. People came from all across Canada and internationally to Hollowaters to see what they were doing because their results were outrageous. When you have a much higher recidivism rate for sex offenders being treated in the Western system, people wanted to know what was the magic, what were they doing? And everybody knew now that this community was a safe place, and this program provided safety for victims and the families of victimizers to move forward. So if we look at it, the investment by the federal and provincial government was so modest. I use that word very carefully. Two governments only contributed $240,000 per year for this program. So, and over 10 years, the total investment by the feds and the province was $2.4 million. And the Hollow Water themselves contributed an average of $60,000 to the healing process and $50,000 worth of volunteer time. Okay, so this was a very invested community. And in the end, we estimated they saved the government between $6 and $15 million, not only in incarceration costs, but in all of the costs of sending people to jail and reintegrating them into the community if they come back. So the other thing is, when we also asked, what are the value-added benefits? You know, and people said they attributed to a sex offender program that they had a Head Start program now, that they had more kids being fostered in the community. Even from surrounding communities, kids are being fostered in the community. So the value-added benefits of this very modest investment by the government was one that transformed a community. And so I also want to talk about the Mama Wichita program, which is closer to home, and it's in Hinton. And so the people from the Hinton Friendship Center went to Hollow Water and looked at what they were doing and tried to build a model that was good for them. And they asked me in 2012 to do a cost-benefits study of what they were doing. And so this program is a therapy-based program. Whereas Hollow Water was really about circle practice, this is about people who are trained as therapists to come in and to use their therapeutic skills within a medicine wheel model. And the goal of the program is to repair relationships between family members in an effort to stop the intergenerational transmission of historic trauma symptoms. Okay, so the Friendship Center started this program, and they said they wanted to be working with entire families. So let's say if an offender is referred to the program and he passes a rigorous assessment so that the community is safe, they do rigorous assessments, they make sure that public safety is maintained. And every single one of the people in this program have committed intrafamilial violence, not random violence in the community. It's in their own family unit. And so what they do is they say, okay, this guy, they start working with the guy, but then they open it up. And they say any person who feels like they are affected by this offender can come forward and get one-on-one, dyadic, or group counseling. On average, 7 community members come and get service. They had one family that 34 family members were offered service because this one person came into the program. This is where it gets super interesting because they see the offender as part of a family unit. They see their services needing to be extended to the family unit. And so over the 5-year period that we studied, there was 68 primary clients, and they had estimated 161 secondary clients. They have never had a reoffense. They've never had anybody, a 0% recidivism rate. When you compare that to the national averages of 14 to 24%, they are off the chart successful. When I do this presentation, sometimes people are saying to me, "You're lying." I'm like, "I'll give you Lisa's phone number. I'm not lying." But it's because of the level of service and the holistic view that they take. So the total cost per family over those 5 years, we estimated to be $23,545. Like, that's not a lot of money to invest. Not even close to a lot of money. And what we found is, so we looked at the first benefit, the cost saved of avoiding incarceration and in participating in this program. And so we estimated that the costs would have been almost $6 million had they gone into jail. And the cost of program participation and probation, because all of the clients are put on probation and they're monitored in the community, not only by probation, but by the Mama Wichita program. So the cost of those 12 clients was $1.27 million. And so we estimated that they saved the federal provincial government $4.6 million and have a much better outcome. Never forget the 0% recidivism rate, because it's not like we're paying for some, kind of whatever program in the community. We're paying for the most successful sex offender programming that we could ever ask for. And so if you look at the largest net benefit, though, is preventing clients from sex offending in the future. So when you look at just that person not reoffending in the future, we estimated that we save between $3.8 and $28 million just not reoffending. This is not even the intergenerational cost savings when you stop the cycle of violence and the next generation does not continue. Because remember, all these family members are getting healing work as well. So even for that, there's an incredible cost savings. The intergenerationals could be hundreds of millions of dollars saved. So when people say healing programs are expensive, it's too expensive to do prevention programs. Early intervention programs are expensive, they're not. They are a cost savings when we deal with the intergenerational effects of historic trauma. We are saving money into the future, and right now and into the future. And so the value added benefit also is that the family members got an incredible amount of therapy that they would probably not have been able to afford if they had to pay for it themselves. The total investment to the program was $1.5 million, and we thought that if those clients would have pursued all that counseling on their own, it would have cost between $10 and $13 million just for the clients. And yet they got that through this quite modestly funded program. So that's my presentation. I'm interested in talking. I guess I didn't do it that quickly, but I tried.
And just a question, Patty, can we get a copy of those slides for the panel members from yesterday and today, or is that?
All right, yeah, no, I can. Yeah, for sure.
I think that would be appreciated, thank you.
Okay. Not yesterday's though, but I'll send today's around.
Okay.
Yes.
I've got Graham.
Thank you, Patty. I think one thing that you mentioned, which was a pretty powerful statement, was someone riding in from a white horse. And I would love to sort of elaborate, if you could elaborate on that, and also the relationship building that third parties really need to do as they start to engaging and working alongside Indigenous communities. And Tyler, I know from your work with Sisika, you could probably supplement a lot of that as well too.
You know, that the comment about the white horse is probably tongue-in-cheek, but and I'm speaking on behalf of being an academic and pursuing a PhD, that we need to be very, very conscientious that all research is based on assumptions, and unless we're willing to unpack those assumptions and often the colonial roots of those assumptions, the science that we base, new models, new practice, the things that the newest tool, the latest information we have for First Nations people, the things that we think, yeah, if they could just understand this, we could fix it all. It's been dangerous in the past. It hasn't worked. And the best approaches are approaches that mobilize community information, mobilize community people, are led by community people. I think that as practitioners, me included, we have tools. I have skills and tools in my toolbox that I'm happy to share. But number one, I can't lead processes in somebody else's community. I can't be in charge of designing and implementing programs when it's not my community that I'm talking about. And this is the idea of allies and partnerships. I bring my toolbox in, I work with the leadership, offer what I have, and find in dialogue and often in circle process, how do we take all of our skills and collective knowledge, knowing that there's deep expertise in community? How do we bring all of this to the fore and build processes that are going to be meaningful? And Tyler had a comment about that.
Yeah, just to add to Patty's comment and your question regarding the white horse, and I probably can talk quite a bit on this, and it's one of the things I enjoy probably doing the most is educating government, federal, provincial, whoever. I enjoy doing that, and it's very important that, like here today, I think Patty gave a great presentation, and I would call it the truth almost, in terms of presenting the facts and the actual realities we face. And the white horse concept is something that obviously I've dealt with over my career, and again, it's always this, and I call it, at least with Health Canada, I call it the FNIB box, First Nations Inuit Health Branch. They come in with the FNIB box, and this is sort of how you're going to run your programs and services, and this is sort of what's best for you Indians. We're going to tell you what's best for you guys, you know. So that's the attitude, and then obviously it's not it's something that really has been ineffective, inefficient, And so, what we do is try to customize our approach and really take a community perspective in terms of designing our programs and services. I can recall, a few months ago, sitting down with the minister, Jane Philpott. We had a good conversation about reconciliation, a long conversation. I said, it's great doing all these wonderful things, but what we need at the community level is reconciliation. That's what we need. And so we actually have a strategy at Siksika called a reconciliation plan. And again, it's based on our own values, customs, and beliefs in all of our programs and services, So we are moving as far away as we can from the federal FNIB box, the provincial box, and creating our own sort of delivery system based, again, our own values, traditions, and beliefs. That's so important. And I think you see some of the results here today in terms of the cost savings and the effectiveness of those programs. So, I strongly believe in that and strongly believe in that approach. And over that time, we've created some very interesting partnerships, never mind with government, but with industry as well. So being able to sort of bring that to the community, mentor our youth, bring those skills, and create, I think, that interest and that capacity, I think, is so important. So, again, getting away from the white horse, sort of coming into the community to save you, And I always tell my colleagues in Alberta and across the country, don't expect government to save you. You have to save yourself, So that's my message wherever I go, whether it's the minister sitting here or whoever's sitting right here. That's the same message I give across wherever I go in my travels.
Peter.
I'd just like to expand a little bit on the implications of Patty's presentation in terms of a sector that we haven't done much interconnection or intersectionality work here, and that's the criminal justice system. Because what Patty was actually presenting is a revolutionary position within the criminal justice system. And there was a case in Canada called Ewart v. Canada, which was a criminal justice case which was appealed and overturned on appeal, but the overturn is actually quite important. In that is the essence of assessing risk for an offender. And the standardized tools that are being utilized for that risk assessment, particularly in terms of sex offending. What essentially Ewart v. Canada found is that the tools are biased, structurally biased against Indigenous and First Nations peoples. And so when Patty talks about recidivism and talks about the inherent involvement of a community to change the recidivistic rate, she's really talking about something that is dramatically different than the criminal justice system of Canada operates from within. Now, what's important on the appeal is the appeal. The decision was overturned, but it was overturned because Ewart couldn't prove personal harm from the use of those instruments. They didn't overturn the racial bias of the instruments. And so when you want to be able to bring a healing program such as what Patty has described into a community, there is a powerful need to overcome the positioning of the psychological community, the mental health community, that sees recidivism as based on factors, and we saw that discussion with the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, where the recidivistic factors are going to be based on things that will automatically bring intergenerational trauma into the equation, and intergenerational trauma will act as a bias factor against the First Nations person. And that will cause an elevated risk conclusion. So when Patty talks about the program that they did at Hollow Water, she's talking about something that is revolutionary in terms of how we think about the criminal justice system, which spills over into the child intervention system, because the child intervention system is struggling to the present time with trying to figure out how do we deal with parents who have a history of sexual offending, and can they be involved in the lives of their children? Patty's program illustrates that possibility, but there is a necessity to begin to replicate that so that we can begin to heal families and move away from this recidivistic structure of the criminal justice system. Sorry I went on long, but I thought it was really important to link these two things together.
So the measurement of risk is something that has taken up a lot of my time for over 15 years, leading processes across the country around measuring risk in Indigenous offenders. So the case that Peter's talking about, I've been living in that space for quite a while. At the same time, we are still measuring risk in the Child Intervention Service all the time. And there are structural biases against Indigenous people that elevate the perception of risk, that most Indigenous people in that community would not say that those factors elevated risk. These are things that could be worked through. I do want to be sure that I'm clear that keeping, for example, what Peter brought up, having children have contact with a parent who has been a sexual offender in the past is not a good idea if there isn't a healing program in there, a good community-based healing program that addresses historic trauma. That's why there's been such outrageous success in the two programs I presented, is that the community had very nuanced, sophisticated processes that would address not just the offender, but the entire family, and that ripples out to the community. And so all of this to say that it is possible, that sometimes there's a hopelessness, helplessness, and powerlessness that is taken on by people who work in the system. What can you do? This is just the way the families are. And it's that hopelessness, when both the client and the service providers feel that, it's debilitating. And I see it all the time. I mean, that spiral is about service providers and clients. Like, we all have to see our interconnectedness. And the beauty of restorative practice is that we can find common ground between a whole bunch of worldviews, in that the professionals come in with one, set of way of looking at things. The caseworker might come in with another way of looking at things, and the family will have their own perspective and their own strengths. And this circle process has the capacity to let people hear each other, to find that common ground, to build a strategy that everybody feels like they're a part of, which is a much different process than the white horse.
We have 2 minutes before our next presentation, and I have 3 people still on the list. So David, Maria, and then Rick, if we can keep it really quick.
Thanks so much, Patty and Tyler. Just briefly, most First Nations people now live off reserve, from what I understand, where there is no sense of extended family and community. How do you think we can address some of those changes, and how can the mainstream service providers get in sync with some of the values and practices you're talking about?
So just to be clear, that lots of people who live in the cities still feel connected to home. They might move back and forth from their home community. Some people have lived in the city intergenerationally, may or may not feel connected. The model that I'm talking about was created by an organization that is not on reserve, like Native Counseling Services of Alberta. It is in rural and urban communities in Alberta, and we still live those Wahotwin teachings. So, Wahotwin is everywhere. It's in the city. It's in this boardroom. So.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, or Chair. Patty, how do we take this forward with the intention of generating recommendations from the committee, particularly with the focus of reconciliation?
So I know that there are pockets of change that are happening within the child intervention system right now. And I know that, for example, and maybe Joni could speak on this, about how foster families are being trained now as compared to before, because that's the beginning of it. How the foster family sees themselves within this larger system is a part of restorative practice. Do you want to talk about that? Just very briefly, because that's part of it.
Right. So when we think about all the points of intersection, we talk about slowing down at the front end and really understanding where a family is at. But they can certainly be the vilified, but they are also the unsung heroes. And so we've taken a look at what does foster caring look like in the context of reconciliation, and trying to do things like, for example, be super clear on the kinds of kids and their families that you might be supporting, and being far more upfront about that and creating expectation that you are comfortable with ceremony, culture, engagement with families right before we even get into the conversation about your ability. Some of the other things we've done is to reframe, and I'm hoping you'll hear that, foster care as the role of foster care is to temporarily support a child and help reunify that family. Whereas before, we may have, and this is not about the foster parents, it's about how we frame the work, framed it as coming in on a white horse. And not badly intended, but that's what we did. In fact, the area that supports the development of the way forward is actually not even called foster care policy or program division. It's called the reunification division, because we want to be intentional all the way through. Now, I'm painting the picture that's certainly aspirational and lots of assembly still required, but it's those kind of things that, can move the dial even a little bit. And it's by no means perfect, but it's heading in those directions.
And so I'm going quick. I'm also working with the department. The paper that you have in your package that I authored is a paper that I've done for the department. Now, we are looking at this understanding of historic trauma and building it into the foundations of caregiver training so that everybody gets that. And then the idea on this is to start talking about healing. If the child intervention workers saw themselves at the forefront of reconciliation, if they saw themselves as the people that are working towards strengthening the Indigenous family, working with Indigenous community, if they saw themselves as that, that's transformational. But this is the kind of work that has to come. I think our recommendations can help support and create more space for training people to believe that they can do this reconciliation work. Nobody comes into children's services or gets trained as a social worker because they want to apprehend kids. That's never, in my mind, what good people believe that they're doing. We have to give them the tools to be able to support families, to imagine with the families, what kind of support they need, and mobilize it and be really well connected with other community services so that those community services can provide some of that service as well. Because as long as you have the power to take the child, it's really hard to be also the person who's bringing the good service, right? So if we work in partnership, if we can imagine a system that we are actually about families, things can change.
Rick, last question.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I'll be as brief as I can. I was listening to the presentation and Tyler's talk about reconciliation, and I appreciate that. So I'm trying to make sense of it in my mind. So is it the fact that you've got a 0% recidivism rate, and I believe you, but that's just incredibly good. I think you would agree with that. Is that because if you send somebody to prison, bad behavior is normalized, and in the community, bad behavior is marginalized? And the other half of my question is it the difference between, in the offender's minds, going to the white man's court, which may have less credibility, or to the community court, which as compared to the community court, which in their mind, taking it seriously, might have more credibility? I just want your thoughts on that, because I'm trying to sort it out in my own mind.
I think I don't think I know. I think the way that healing needs to be addressed, it's not that it's impossible to do it in jail, but jails are focused on punishment, on top of punishment, on top of punishment. About 15 years ago, Canada led the way in healing programs and trying to look at different ways of doing healing, Indigenous worldview ways of doing healing, and has moved away from that in some way, shape, or form. It's not impossible to create a correctional system that would actually rehabilitate and address historic trauma. It's just not happening. So that's the issue.
Thank you once again, Patty, for your presentation. And I believe we have our next presenters, the Métis Nation of Alberta. Are they all here with us? They are. Wonderful, so we can move on.
Maybe grab you a coffee or water.
And so I would like to introduce Dr. Jill Spiritus, who is the Director of Health and Wellness, Cordine Gerlat, Children's Services Manager, and Kelsey Bradburn, Senior Manager of Health, Children and Youth from the Métis Nation of Alberta, who will share their experiences with the panel. The agency has requested that this portion of the meeting be held in camera. And we will take about 20 minutes for the presentation, and then we'll have about 15 minutes for discussion. So I'd invite the panel to go ahead.
On February 15th of this year as their Director of Health and Wellness, and specifically Health, Children and Youth. So I'm going to start. We're not going to do a formal presentation. We're really going to kind of talk about our experiences, some of the challenges that we've had, some of the solutions we think that we can offer. But I am going to start with a story. March 25th of this year, we held a seniors and youth symposium here in Edmonton where we brought together youth and seniors from across the province to share their lived experiences amongst each other. And one of the sort of break sessions, our president, Audrey Patra, was sitting at a table, and a young girl who was about 13 came up to her and sat down next to her. And she said, "Oh, my stomach, it's hurting." And so President Patra said, "Well, why is it hurting?" And she said, "I ate too much." And she said, "You ate too much?" She goes, "Yes, the beef and the chicken, there was just so much meat, and I ate and I ate." And she said, "Well, why would you do that?" And she says, "Well, I'm not allowed to have meat at home anymore." And she said, "Well, why is that?" And she said, "Well, the family that I live with now, they're vegetarians and they don't allow meat in the house." So she said, "Well, I'll pack you up some and you can take it home with you." And she said, "No, I did that before and they took it from me when I walked in." So after that, did a little bit of sort of looking into what that situation was. And that was a young girl in care who was in the care of a family who was of Asian descent, and they just don't allow meat in the house, was a Métis girl who truly looked at that entire situation and felt that she was taken out of one situation and put into a worse situation because she could not eat meat anymore, which was a sizable connection to her heritage and to her culture. I found that story incredibly heartbreaking. I don't know what you all feel about it, but I thought, wow, like, we don't know the situation she came out of, but how horrible that she can't eat meat anymore. So when I look at this and the situation that we're trying to address, which is in a lot of ways extremely insurmountable, we have to really concentrate on the fact that culture and a connection to community is extremely important. So I wanted to share that story with you as a starting point. From there, we're gonna talk about sort of the background and what the Métis Nation does. And I think I will turn it over to Kelsey to kind of talk about that background.
Good morning. So I'm not sure if you guys are all aware of kind of what the Métis Nation does in regards to Métis children, families, and youth. Currently, we have just signed a 10-year framework agreement with the province, and within that agreement, it just shows that there's a commitment for us to work together. And we've had that framework agreement for the last 30 years. And within that agreement, we have a sub-agreement. And that sub-agreement started in 1987, and this year marks the 30th year of us entering into agreement with children, families, and youth. And it's important to note that that agreement, the dollars that we have received has not changed in the last 30 years. So we're operating on $150,000 a year. And what we know is that there's over 96,000 Métis individuals that have self-identified from the 2011 Canadian Census. And in our membership database, we have over 36,000 that have received their membership from the Métis Nation of Alberta. So it just kind of paints a picture of kind of what we're dealing with and the scope of the needs that and challenges that happen when we get involved with children and families. And over the past 30 years, things have changed and evolved. And in 2012, there was a provincial council motion to enter into or start the discussions of a child accord or agreement or MOU, just to propel the policy and the legislation pieces that we haven't been necessarily involved with. So it's taking those services that we give to our members, but actually having a voice around the table and kind of propelling what we hear from our community. And since 2012, it's kind of been stalled. So we're looking at ways that we can come to the table, have our voice heard, have our community voices heard, and that's kind of where we're at right now. We do have 2 agreements with Children's Services, and those agreements are within the Edmonton area and then within the Northwest Central region. And so that 150 goes to cover some work that we do there. And those regions give $25,000. So it just kind of paints a picture of what we're dealing with and the challenges that we have. So that's kind of
the original sort of discussion around a children's accord, a Métis Children's Accord, began back in 2013. And at about 2014, the sort of ongoing revisions of that accord stopped. Change in government, change in decision to propel it forward. So we're really looking to start to move that now to address some of the significant concerns that we see. When we think about, obviously, UNDRIP, the MNA understands that the Alberta government is committed to renewing its relationship with Indigenous people. We believe that the government's intention is to transform that relationship with us as a Métis governing body and have the opportunity to participate as equals. We believe that the Alberta government is working to bring about that renewed relationship specific to the principles and the objectives of UNDRIP. But I want to point out sort of 3 or 4 areas that are really important to us. Article 3, Indigenous people have that right to self-determination. And when we look at things like Article 8, for example, Indigenous people and individuals have the right to not be subjected to forced assimilation or deconstruction of their culture. The story that I started with is exactly that, isn't it? It's forcing somebody who really and truly had a connection with their culture to now be part of a completely different culture. Lack of complete respect for what they came from and who they identify as being. So I want to talk now about some of the challenges that we see specifically. I'm going to have Cordine, as the manager of child services with the MNA, talk about some of those challenges.
Good morning. So working with the Children's Services offices, our challenges are that they don't identify children when they do come into care. So it's difficult for us to have that connection and with the families or with the children to get them connected to culture and that thing. So it's part of the process of when they come in is they do a check with the Métis settlements, but they don't do one with the Métis Nation. And it's a mandate for the settlements, but not for the Métis Nation right now. There's, let's see.
You can start right here for you.
Children are not, so they're not being properly identified. Métis children are being placed in homes, like Jill was saying with her story, that they're not within their culture.
They're completely unsuitable.
Yeah. Ensuring that Métis children have the opportunity to participate and preserve Métis culture and heritage. So the M&A is not being accessed properly by the CFSA with youth and children. If the Métis Nation becomes involved with a Métis child and family, it's usually when a child becomes PGO. So now there's timelines. So now it's a rush to try and find a family that can be connected with them for a kinship purpose or just being fostered as well through a Métis family. Home assessments, they're not culturally sensitive. We all know that. They're not geared towards probably all cultures, not just Métis, but the home assessments are very invasive.
Just to expand on that a little bit as well, one of the questions on that home assessment is how many times do you and your spouse have sex a week? How is that relevant? I get at some point, somewhere down the line, something has happened and these questions have continued to be layered upon to try and avoid some situation at some point. But of course, that is going to put somebody off if we're trying to convince them to take in a child and care for them. Some people don't want to answer those questions. They feel it's none of anybody's business. And probably have a very valid point there. So they are extremely intrusive questions. And, they get to that point and sort of say, I'm out. So
CFS offices are determining whether a child is Métis instead of the M&A making that decision or determination. And it's just a process of them connecting with us saying, hey, we might have a Métis child in care. And we're more than happy to make those connections through our database system or do a quick genealogy of that family to find out where the connections are, if they are Métis or if they're not Métis. The Métis Nation, like when a child is in care and we are involved, we do help with the cultural connections, the cultural planning, their concurrent planning, community connections, keeping them involved in whatever activities we have going on in the communities. So our resource worker works closely with families and children to have that connection. So according to the Enhancement Act Policy Manual, Métis Settlements is required to notify the M&A when a Métis child has been identified. However, we rarely, if at all, get notified from the Métis settlement that they do have a child in their care there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it lists out in the Enhancement Act specifically who, I think it's a settlement council, registrar under the Indian Act. There's a number of individual benefits to person of Inuit ancestry. However, ultimately, that last sentence is really important, which is the purpose of facilitating an application for the child's Aboriginal status and for execution of the child's right as a person with Aboriginal status. That's what the M&A does. The M&A is there as a self-governing body to propel the rights of Métis people forward, and yet we're not informed if a child comes into care. We did meet with one individual from, and it doesn't matter which CFS region, who told us that he and his team make the determination as to whether somebody is Métis. They don't call, they don't let us know, they just decide whether or not. So he said that he figures he has 30 out of the 700 plus, and we know of 20 right now. But we also know from places like the Office of the Child
in Region 7,
is it the Office of the Child? Oh, goodness. Anyway, we know that there's probably over 600 Métis kids in care, yet we know of 20, and we know of 30 that we don't know their names. And that's it. That's all we know about. We're here. We're wanting to be part of that connection. We hear from our community all the time how many families would like to adopt a child to keep them in, or would like to foster a child to keep them in their own culture. But we're not involved to be able to make those connections and to assist with that and keep that cultural connection alive. So we find that part of it extremely challenging. So if we talk about sort of some of the solutions that we see as an opportunity to improve this, first of all, to solidify that Children's Accord, MOU, agreement, I don't care what it gets called. I don't want us to get caught up in wording, but it's about solidifying and getting a true commitment from the government to working with the Métis Nation to keep these children in their culturally appropriate environments. We want multi-year funding. We have this 10-year framework agreement, and every year we need to reapply for the $150,000. Every single year, it hasn't changed in 30 years, but we need to reapply for it and re-sign a grant for it, even though we have a multi-year framework agreement in place. We want a commitment to enhance those funding dollars, because I'm sure you all are aware, $150,000 does not go very far. We want the M&A involved at the policy level, at the decision-making table. We want to be part of that. We're here. We want to have that involvement. So work to involve us to improve the interests of the Métis people. Change legislation. That this Enhancement Act that doesn't even include the M&A is crazy. We're talking about 100,000 people that self-identify in this province as Métis. The Métis Settlements General Council is included there, but that includes 5,000 people as opposed to 100,000. We want consent to consult a Métis resource as mandated. We want to have, we want to let you know that the M&A expedites any child application that comes through. We can have an answer within 5 days from our genealogy department whether or not that child is Métis. And we're prepared to do that. We're prepared to move that up even further if need be. We've heard stories about children's names being sent to the Métis General Settlements Council, and they come back 9 to 10 months later with an answer as to whether or not they're Métis. And then if they're not, because they don't fall under those 5,000, registered members, we're not being involved. We're not even being told. We're willing to work with the settlements. We want to work with them so that there is a reciprocal passing back and forth if one is not falling under the M&A but would fall under the Settlements Council. And as I've said, we want to change to that Enhancement Act. In the end, we want CFS mandated to notify us if there's a potential that the child is Métis, and then we can help. We want to help. We have a desire to help. So I think that's pretty much everything that we wanted to share with you from our current experience, and sort of put it all out there, and hopefully we can work together to start to address some of these issues.
All right, I have some questions. We'll begin with Rick.
Thanks, Chair. I'll try to be brief. I know there's little time and lots of questions. Two things occurred to me. Well, actually a little more than two, but two that I'll take your time with now. It does seem ridiculous that if you got a multi-year program, you got to reapply for the $150,000 funding every year, and it also seems 30 years without an increase seems like more than a little bit excessive. So that if there's something there, you probably need to have a conversation with government about. Now, on the other side, I'll be a little harder on you. I hope you don't mind, but this is an honest question. If the Métis settlements are not sharing information with you, is that a you problem or a government problem?
Given that they're mandated to do so and we have no jurisdiction over them, I don't think it's our problem.
Okay, so the jurisdiction should be changed perhaps then, so that you can enforce that? Is that what you're suggesting?
I'm not, no, I'm not suggesting that. I don't want
So-
jurisdiction over the Métis settlements. I don't think that anybody in the M&A does. I think that we need to be listed as somebody who's informed.
No, you just made a good case. It is a government problem and not a you problem, and thank you. Nice, succinct, powerful. I appreciate the answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the three of you for being here. It was a very helpful presentation. One of the things I want to focus on children not being identified as Métis when they come into care. That you said it's a mandate for settlements, but not the Métis Nation. One of the things, and I'll ask you this question, but if there's other panel members, especially the two to my left and Patty, perhaps have some insight into this. If you have an answer for this. I remember early on in this process, we were presented with some statistics about percentages of children in care. And there's a substantial, obviously, overrepresentation of Indigenous children in care. And Métis children were carved out of that as a portion, but the number was quite small, which looked to be surprisingly similar to the overall number of Métis children in Alberta's population, seemed to be pretty much correlated exactly with the number of children in care. To which my conclusion is, oh, well, that seems to be, things probably are better there, was my conclusion looking at those statistics. So A, are you aware of that statistic? And B, if you can just comment on that and whether or not, in fact, that perhaps it's because of the way that the system simply doesn't ask the question.
I think it's multi-level in terms of the reason why the numbers are as they are. We did have a meeting with the minister a couple of weeks ago, and those numbers were presented to us as well. I can tell you, number one, anecdotally, we hear from our community a lot more in care than are actually being identified. Are the questions being asked? I don't know what happens when a child does come into care. Not sure. That office I was telling you about earlier that I was struggling with the name on is the Office of the Child and Youth Advocate. They are currently reporting numbers in and around 500-600. So I do also believe that some people don't self-identify. So we need to remember that there's not a whole lot of benefit to identifying as Métis. And a lot of people have intergenerational trauma whereby they've been told by their families, don't tell anyone. In fact, I have one right here next to me who, in no uncertain terms, grew up very proud of her Métis culture, but was told by her parents, don't tell people, because you could be discriminated against and you could find that there will be challenges that you will face. And I would offer that there's probably a very real possibility that that still happens today. I also think there are people who just determine whether or not somebody is, and that happens well before. And I offered the example of the person we were dealing with, one of the CFS regions, who said, we make the determination whether or not they're Métis. We decide based on, we have a list of steps we follow to determine whether or not they're Métis.
One of those steps is not to ask M&A.
It does not involve the M&A, ever.
And you have the resources that you can do genealogical
We have a
studies.
genealogy
and you've got that
department.
whole, that's how
All
you
family
determine that.
trees. We even try and link via aunts and uncles and further back, because sometimes we don't have, sort of the initial family data. We do very much so have that. In fact, I would say that our genealogy department is the best in the country.
And I'm sorry, very quickly, I just want to confirm. So the 500 to 600 number of Métis identified kids in care, is it your opinion that the number of reported kids in care in Alberta that are identified as Métis is grossly underrepresented of the actual number of kids in care who are Métis in Alberta?
I believe that the number is closer to what we hear out of that child advocate office than the number that the government is currently reporting.
That's helpful, thank you.
Patty?
Good morning.
Good morning.
As a fair-skinned, blue-eyed, blonde-haired Métis, I appreciate a lot of what you're saying about intergenerational trauma and about children growing up either not knowing or not being willing to identify. And I think that that point landed squarely with the panel. I also am very interested, you were here when I was talking about restorative practice, around including the M&A not only in the Act, which is something we can definitely make a recommendation for, around consultation around children, and the genealogy work. I would say most intervention workers have no idea that the M&A has that kind of a database. That's kind of inside ball, I would say, within the Métis community in Alberta, the robustness of this database that came around hunting rights, right? It was kind of started in that.
Started off harvesting,
unless you really a traditional hunter and we're looking for your Métis card, that might not have landed. So it would be a little bit of awareness raising perhaps within the department itself that this information actually exists. That could be part of it. I know that you're asking for more than just consult with the M&A when a child is apprehended. So if we could go past that, how would you like us to change legislation so that you have more than a consultation? What is it that you would really like to have if you had a little bit more money maybe and a few more resource workers? What would you like to have to help reconnect these children to their identity, which is a big part of healing?
Absolutely it is. The first thing that I'm going to let Cordine address is your very first point, which is that maybe those frontline staff are not aware that this isn't...
Maybe I'm wrong.
So go ahead, Cordine.
So within our contracts within Region 6 and Region 7, we do ongoing presentations to all the offices. So we'll get in touch with the manager, the new staff that come on. We do go out and do a presentation, even if it's only 2 of them, 50 of them, whatever. We are out there. We have toolkits that we present to them with all the information that is on our website as well, so that they can contact us, go online, apply, do applications, get in touch with a Métis resource worker. It's all presented to them.
And even the other region that I had mentioned, that he came to us. We didn't seek him out. He came to us to let us know about these 30 kids he had determined were Métis. So I think he was very well aware. And I think that there was in history, and maybe you can talk to this, there was a connection, or there was a resource worker that was in place, and it didn't work because there was no... Anyway, you can go ahead, Kelsey.
Yes, we did. In that particular region that Jill's talking about, we did have a resource worker there, and it broke down because there wasn't a lot of community connection. She worked within the Children's Services office, and the community didn't want to access her within that office. So it was kind of interesting. It was the first time that we kind of piloted that project, and it definitely broke down in a hurry. I think she was there only 6 months, and it just goes to show that our community is not accessing the needs within Children's Services Department. And along the lines that Cordine was talking about is our Métis resource workers will actually go out and assist the workers with creating those family trees and filling out the forms for them, because we know that they're bogged down with multiple files. We realize that, and so we're there to assist them and help them with this, and ensuring that Métis children are identified so they are connected with their cultural and possibly some community connections. And so we do offer those services to come out, meet with the worker, we fill out the file, and we even will go one step further and look through the volumes of files to try and create that genogram that will help us within our Métis Nation membership database to connect them. Yeah.
And so what we would do, if you just want to extend on that a little tiny bit, if we had all the resources in the world, what would we do? We want to keep those Métis children in Métis families. That's what we want to do. We also have heard that there's a number of Métis families that are willing to adopt those permanent wards, those individuals who are not going to go back to, their families. They're willing to adopt, but they have no idea where to start. How do I even find out if there's a Métis child that, that is looking for that home, that, forever home? We're wanting to be part of that. We want to do that. So we would set up those connections. We would be fully involved in that, if we had all the money in the world.
Yeah.
So
or
that's-
even more than 150,000. I think that's what we would do.
Yeah.
You have some.
So with that all being said, with our database, that's where we can get our connections with the kinship and that sort of thing for families and children in care.
That's another point that I want to quickly highlight as a major challenge that I forgot to kind of mention. This kinship idea. As you all know, if you foster a child, you're paid to foster that child because it costs tons of money to raise children. I know because I have one who cost me an arm and a leg. And so, of course, there has to be an assistance to make that happen. But if there's a kinship, if I step in and I say, oh, that's my cousin's child and I'll take that child in, there is no funding for that. And so, and certainly a lot less, but if it doesn't even result in an opening of a file, then there is no funding at all. And so then if I already have 3 children myself and then I take in, my cousin's daughter who I'm trying to prevent going into the system, I now need to, spread those funds even thinner amongst my current 3 children. That's a sizable problem. But I still think they would take them in anyway if they were given the opportunity, because that's what we hear in our community all the time. We hear this at our annual General Assemblies. This is important to us. We want to keep our Métis kids in Métis families. We want to do that. So we have that ability to make that happen, and we're not being consulted at all.
We've got only a couple minutes left, but I've got Maria and Peter.
Thank you, Madam Chair. How can child intervention better honor cultural connection and incorporate Métis cultural healing and teachings?
I think if you're referring to not placing a Métis child with a Métis family, if you're referring to doing that, then there has to be, at a minimum, mandated teaching to that family about Métis culture and understanding that Métis culture, and an expectation of that family to keep them connected, to attend, Métis events and celebrations, and an ongoing discussion within that family home about their Métis culture. If we want to take it a step further, it's about involving the MNA as the self-governing body of the Métis people of Alberta. Involve us and have us help and be part of that. Have us help you connect with families and resources. I mean, we're starting to get phone calls now from just regular public schools. Can you come and just do a presentation, because we hear so much information about First Nations, but we don't really understand Métis culture. We don't know it. Come and just teach us and show us. We have a Métis child in our class who has told us, that that's not Métis culture when a First Nations person comes to do a presentation. The resources are there. I just don't think they're being accessed, and I'm not sure that it's necessarily because nobody knows it exists. I think it's just been easy to not. There's no mandate to inform us, let us know, include us, involve us. So that's, I think, why it's happened.
Thank you.
Peter?
2 very quick questions. You've correctly identified that the home assessment model is not
culturally appropriate
normed or developed within Aboriginal or Métis cultures. So question number 1 is, what would you replace that with? Question number 2 is, what's your relationship with Métis Child and Family Services?
From what I understand, and I was not here when they, obviously for all of the history, we don't have a bad relationship with Métis Child and Family Services. It is removed. I think there's some history there. But I have to be quite honest with you, I really don't care about what the history is in terms of any kind of breakdown with another group that's out there. We will work with anybody starting today to improve the overall process for Métis children in care. So, you know, I think that's as far as I'm prepared to discuss that relationship, because I have no history on it. The fact of the matter is, we're prepared to work with anyone in any way possible for the betterment of those children that are in care. Your first question, you'll have to remind me.
So the home family assessment, along with lots
yes.
of other psychometrics, are not normed within Indigenous or Métis populations. What would you replace it with?
I think it needs to be overhauled and revamped for sure. I think we all need to sit down with different levels of the M&A. Some of our members, we need to get feedback from the M&A is not going to just, change it. We are a government, but a democratically elected government. And so I think involving from, a focus group perspective, those that have been involved in the process would probably be more valuable than anything else. Do I have, ideas around what questions we could ask as opposed to other ones and things like that? For sure. But I think it needs to be a more holistic approach and involving those that have had a lot of experience with this particular system. I think it's just always kind of been top down, right? And instead of really having a collaborative approach with those that have had significant experience. I don't know if either of you have anything else you'd like to add.
One thing I would like to add on the home assessments too is you asked us how can we get involved, and I think this is another avenue that we could and we would be willing to assist with in actually being the home, doing the home assessments for those Métis families that have come forward. What we've noticed in the past few years is that they're
more comfortable
with the Métis resources or the M&A asking the same questions as, say, Children's Services, just in a different manner. And they're more willing and able to come forward. So that might be another opportunity for us to become involved there.
Expanding on that just a little bit, we've quickly noticed, as the Director of Health and Wellness, I will tell you, Métis people do not access health services that are currently available to them. They don't access them because they're not culturally appropriate services. But that has been seen in housing, that has been seen in employment, that's been seen in education. And when the M&A has done initiatives and driven those things in those three areas, the uptake of access of services has increased tenfold, multifold. We can't even, so it's when it's M&A driven and it's Métis culturally appropriate services being driven by the M&A, it's a completely different experience for Métis people. So having a significant involvement in this right from the very beginning, maybe there's not a whole lot of change to that tool. I really liked the way you formed that, Kelsey. Maybe it's just the way it occurs and who leads that charge. You might get a lot more, involvement and acceptance of it if it's done in a different manner.
Our time has now run out, but we want to thank our presenters from the Métis Nation of Alberta. We really appreciate that presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And we're now scheduled to take a very short 10-minute break, after which we'll reconvene and hear from the Council for Quality Assurance.
Yes, just leave them there, for sure. Oh, thank you guys. Thank you. Nice to meet you too. Very much for coming. Thank you.
I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. And winding up for something. Thank you. Nice to meet you.
You've been at it for how many months?
Just since February 15th.
So you're getting into the role. And who was there before you?
A few months before me. it was Sarah Carmen.
So you're a medical PhD, and how does this relate to the elected leadership? I don't understand what how the organization
Works. If you were to take municipal government, for example, you have your mayor, so our president is President Matra. We have, if you were to look at council, we have a provincial council, our democratically elected presidents and vice presidents in each region. And then I lead the charge for any public policy communications, sometimes intergovernmental affairs, but from administrative. So we're in the administrative arm. Provincial council.
so you have providing medical health services?
We are.
You're talking about services where you believe that community settlement go to everything.
Yeah, so that's a settlement. So that's only 5,000 people on settlements. The rest of the state will live
But your responsibility is for all of it.
Focus.
Maybe service Child and Family Services Association.
Are you a separate association?
I don't think I'm.
Child and Family Services are centered in Edmonton. They're not under your jurisdiction. They're an independent organization.
I'd like to call the committee back together here, please. And we will be hearing from the County Council for Quality Assurance, and I would like to introduce Donna Boulanger, the chair, Gayla Rogers, council member, who are both with the council, and they will do a presentation. We'll have about 15 minutes for the presentation and then about 15 minutes of discussion with the panel. So please take it away, ladies. And just a reminder with the microphones, we are back on live stream, and that you have to operate your own microphone, but remember to also turn it off when you're done, so that, because we can only have limited numbers on at the same time.
Sure, we had the little in-service about the mics before, so hopefully we remember for the 30 minutes that we're here. So thank you for inviting us back again to present about the council, our experiences outside of the death reviews that we did, and also our recommendations for both a quality council going forward, and also we will present some of the insights we've learned over the years in terms of opportunities for early intervention and prevention. We also wanted to comment on your Phase 1 recommendations and having the advocate as the external review source for child deaths, and think that was a really great recommendation, so and support that 100%. And also your comment about the internal child death review being a quality assurance function, and so just the mention that there, to support that there should be an internal quality assurance death review process, we think is very important as well. We put the names of the council members up front instead of we had them at the end, but we moved them up front so you could see the disciplines that people are coming from. So we have myself from public health and in AHS, and also I have a maternity and pediatric background. Gayla Rogers, former Dean Social Work U of C, and just in the half an hour we've been here, I think she knows everybody, so that's good. You know her and trust her. And Eva Cardinal is our Cree elder, and she sent us a good luck message this morning, and she says, she said, insulate your backbone with courage. And so we will do that today. Kent Henderson, former member, Calgary Police Service and Zebra Child Protection, and he presented our first phase with the child death review. And Del Graff is also on our committee from the Advocate's Office. We mentioned the last time we were here that we have had 2 members resign, a pediatrician from child abuse up in Edmonton, and also a judge from criminal court who was from the south. And we have been, our multidisciplinary is, sort of like a multidisciplinary, is kind of getting a little bit smaller. One of the things we'll talk about is needing to expand that scope as well. A little bit of a brief history. I'm not sure what everybody knows, but I'll just do the basics, and in the questions, if you have further questions, would be happy to answer those. The council started from a 2010 review of the child intervention system. It was a year-long process which came up with many recommendations. And then in 2011, there was an external panel responding to a very bad death of a child. And that was a multidisciplinary group that also had recommendations. And both of those, to note, recommended that there be a quality assurance council for the child intervention system. And so the legislation was established in 2011. And in 2014, the council's mandate was expanded, one, to add, monitor, and evaluate the director's activities, and two, the first few years we were only looking at children in care. And when you're looking at quality assurance, you look at it from the first phone call into the system. And what their experience is through the system, not just for the kids in care, but the kids in kinship, the kids receiving enhanced services. And so that mandate was expanded. And not on here, but part of the mandate at that point was also that we would report on the director's activities. And so our annual report for the last few years has contained an evaluation of certain activities that we could evaluate. The mandate, there's 6 different areas that we focus on, and one of them being the development of the service quality framework, which Gayla will talk about shortly, identifying systemic issues for potential quality assurance committees, reviewing, let me go over to the other side, making recommendations to the minister for the improvement of services, identifying effective practices within intervention services, and monitoring and evaluating the director's activities. And so how we do these is through information that's given to us. So we have presentations from different areas, we ask questions, we suggest different avenues, we learn, we ask for different presentations if we know that something exists. We mostly get what we are given. One area where we have been able to really get into the practice is in the reviewing of the serious injuries, reviewing the files, so the serious injuries and the deaths. And that's where we've identified where there seem to be some trends, some gaps, some different areas that are worthy of further investigation and have not been, as far as we know, been investigated.
One of the things we discovered early in our work was no systematic way of gathering the voices of the kids and families who use the system or receive services. Sometimes they're called clients, sometimes they're referred to as service users. But this was incorporated into changes in the legislation to actually state clearly that one of the activities of the Council for Quality Assurance was to develop a way of ensuring that the voices of and the experience of people receiving the services, using the system, were gathered. We worked with what was then the ACCFCR, now PolicyWise, and the ministry to develop what's referred to now as the SQF, the Service Quality Framework. We engaged a number of families, youth, children, and asked them what good service looked like and what would it feel like if they had high quality experience in their interaction with the system. And from that, teased out a service quality framework. And I think you've been given information on that. So I'm not going to go into detail on the service quality framework, but just to say that there are a number of jurisdictions around the world who have for a number of years incorporated this perspective into the evaluation of their work, and that it becomes part and parcel of the way of doing the work. And I think the ministry is very excited about the potential to, evaluate the casework practice model. They ask the workers what their experience of working in the system is, and now to be able to add the voices of the people who actually receive the services creates something that's much more comprehensive and integrated in attempting to assure quality from a variety of perspectives. What's left to do is the implementation. So the framework has been built. It's been on an evidence base. They did a thorough environmental scan looking at jurisdictions who have done this. And now the next phase is to develop the implementation plan, build the tools, pilot test the tools, and create the processes. So we're really looking forward to seeing this work come to its full fruition with its implementation. And I think that from what I've been observing of your work, these are questions that you've been asking from the very beginning. How do you gather the voices, the stories, the experiences of the children, the families, the relatives of the people who interface with the system? So we're looking forward to seeing this continue. Going forward, I would like to say that I think the creation of the Quality Council was a bold move from a minister who was, some ministers are more activist than others, and some ministers are very confident in the bureaucracy, which is a very experienced and seasoned group of individuals. But the development of a Quality Council for Children's Services initially was meant to sort of complement the Health Quality Council. There's also a Quality Council in post-secondary. So the idea that there is a Council for Quality Assurance in children's services or child intervention is, I think, built on sound principles. I think we're here to say it's not about us, but there's something of value inherently in a Council for Quality Assurance that engenders public trust, that there is a public reporting factor, that there is access to directly report to a minister, and that there is a way to ensure that the efforts to promote, ensure, sustain, and measure quality are in place, especially for this most vulnerable population. We think that, as Donna mentioned, our numbers have shrunk. Losing 2 people from diverse professions has, I think, had an impact on the council's work. If the council is to continue, if it's to morph into some other form, we would encourage that there be a breadth of professional backgrounds, experience backgrounds, certainly somebody who's grown up in the system, would contribute as well. And we think that staggered appointments are a good idea. We think having enabling legislation is important, and certainly having the resources to do the work is important.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about early intervention and moving a focus in that direction. And I'm going to give you some of the examples that we've learned from our conversations with people, from reviewing files, reviewing cases, and looking at trends and gaps. So the first story I have is, it was a story that came from a neonatal intensive care nurse. And she said that in their neonatal intensive care, normally they can have about 35 babies, and every single day, any day of the week, they'll have 3 or 4 babies in withdrawal. So mom has problems with drug, alcohol, and babies are born addicted, and then they go through withdrawal. Usually they're premature as well. She said, now, this is anecdotal. I get that. And so part of it is finding out what is the truth, what is going on. She says that they used to be able to call social services who would come in and assess the mom, is it safe for the baby to go home? She says, but they don't do that now. They wait, they just have to discharge the baby home and then wait for something to happen. And so then the Alberta Children's Hospital call over and say, we've got one of your clients, the baby was hurt, they're in the hospital. And so it's one area where early intervention could make a huge difference. And so is that happening? Is it not happening? I don't know. It's anecdotal. But it is a story from a nurse working in the system. So another on the same theme, and by the way, you might have been told this, but 0 to 4 years is the greatest number of deaths of the children who are dying in care or receiving services. It's the 0 to 4 years. So this is another theme, again with babies, at-risk babies, and these are babies who are referred to the AVERT program. And have you heard about that one? Okay, great. So you know what it is, 0 to 3 months, and we found that now as we review deaths and serious injuries, we're finding that there's a baby 0 to 3 months and their story might go on. They might not die till 7 or 8 or 9 months, but there's this whole prenatal history, early history, and the babies aren't in AVERT. They don't have the nurse, the social worker, and the police. They're not on that team. And when we ask why not, well, the program's full. They couldn't take them. Plus, this program is only in Calgary and Edmonton. So looking at this program, I think, is critical. One, to evaluate it using research methodology. Does it really make a difference? It seems that it makes a difference. Does it make a difference just for those 3 months? Does it help at 6 months? Does it help at 12 months? So to do some follow-up and find out what difference does it make, and if it's making a difference, then it needs to be province-wide. Another story. So we often, again, see signs when we're looking at stories, we're looking backwards, we see indications of sexual abuse at a young age. And either somebody's reported, the child has said something, or there's physical signs. There's bruises, there's bleeding, there's bedwetting, there's afraid to be alone with somebody. You know, subtle kinds of signs that are not so subtle that they're not written down in the file that we get, the review that we get. And they're always, not always, when they are investigated, they often come back unsubstantiated. So it can't be proven. And then what happens? File closed. And then the child is readmitted to the, into care or receiving services. And there's more problems. And every time the child is readmitted, the behaviors get worse and worse and worse and worse. And then when they're 12 or 14 or 16, we get the file, died by suicide. So if early childhood sexual abuse can be identified, can be followed up, if it's unsubstantiated, can they not follow that a little bit longer? Can they touch base? Can they... I don't know what the answer is, but I know that it's an opportunity and that it's being lost. Also, sexual abuse is not included in the definition of serious injury, and we think it is. We think that it should be included in the definition of serious injury, and they should be reported as such, and that they should be investigated as they're done in the processes, the internal review process that's now in place. I have many more examples. I'll just talk about one more example because I know we have to get on to your questions. So one more example is lack of communication. And we see files where children have received services in one area. They might have psychological assessment. They might have, the child might have been talking about suicide, or they might have certain behaviors. Family moves, they go to a different area. Social services may pick them up, not a referral, but something happens and they're, RCMP or something, they're picked up again. But nobody knows what happened in the first place. The communication between, say, DFNA and CFS in a city isn't as robust as it could be. We'd like to see where those groups, like Calgary CFS and the DFNAs in their area, meet regularly to talk about shared files, to talk about families that are moving back and forth, so that everybody has the information. What assessments have been done, what treatments have been done, what's working, what does this child need? And so rather than close files or say, oh, we can't find them, good luck. It's, you know, people are followed, people are found, children are watched, and families are supported. So besides the DFNA CFSA communication, the electronic system the charting system that they have is paper and electronic. And I don't know how cumbersome that is, but it seems to me that there should be one way. There should be an electronic system where people can do their charting, where all the information is, and where people anywhere in the province can, you know, if you're an authorized user, can tap into that and get the information so that if somebody moves, you find their file somewhere else. One of the files, and I believe it was the one that brought us all here today, was that the siblings were looked at, somebody looked at the file, you know, looked online, saw that they were taken care of by another area, left a voice message because they couldn't get into the file to see what was going on because they were locked out. So could something have happened earlier for that little girl? I don't know. But looking at that charting system, they need to look at that. And so I will pass this back to Gayla.
I think I already talked enough about the what needs to happen next with the service quality framework, but I would just like to pick up on something that Donna mentioned, and that is Joni talked about earlier the need to slow down the opening of files and pay a lot of attention to really understanding what's going on with that child, with that family in the context of their community. And I would just like to say that I think they should really slow down on closing files as well and put as much emphasis in the closing as they do on the opening. I think one of the things we see is that they close and then they're open, and they close and then they're open. I think there needs to be a much better plan on closing with touchstone points, with 3 months, 6 months, even 1 year follow-up to ensure that that family is in their reunification is staying on track. So we'll just move to the next point. Again, has been reiterated. I think there is an absolute vital role for a Council of Quality Assurance to play in the internal review of deaths and serious injury. I think that would go a long way to credibility, transparency, and ensuring quality, that there is an oversight and a participation from this an arm's length but internal body that could really lend value to the process and certainly go a long way for public trust. And finally, I think there is the use of data. I think that what we're seeing in the Child and Youth Data Lab, what we're seeing in the work of PolicyWise, formerly the Alberta Centre for Child, Family, Community Research, is an incredible harvesting of anonymized data from multiple ministries that can serve to really inform the child intervention system on trends, especially the interface of children receiving services, children in the system with the healthcare system, the criminal justice system, and even in terms of the education. You know, what kids are graduating high school, what kids are ending up in the juvenile justice system. I think that the use of data and the partnership with PolicyWise, being as evidence-informed as possible in decision-making is absolutely critical. Of course, I am a researcher, but I would say that, but it's essential. And finally, one of the early recommendations we made as a Council for Quality Assurance was the fact that there are so many recommendations that come into the system, be they from the Advocate's Office or other reviews, or there are recommendations on recommendations, and there needed to be a tracking system. And I think the Ministry has done an excellent job building a recommendations tracking system. I think there's a role for the council to play on monitoring, on reporting, on how that tracking, how the recommendations are tracked, progress is made, and completion. I think that's important work, and I think it's a function that a quality council can oversee. And finally, I think I've made all these points.
I can say something.
Okay.
So this slide was mainly about if there is to be a Quality Assurance Council, and as we said, we don't mean this one, we don't mean us specifically, but we mean a Quality Assurance Council function overseeing the child intervention system, that legislation and regulations are critical to outline what the responsibilities and duties are. We've had many ministers, different deputy ministers, and with each one, everything seemed to shift. What people expect that we can't have access to shifts. So it needs to be clear, really clear, spelled out in the legislation what a Quality Assurance Council should do, should have the budget and the staffing, make sure they're sufficient. Right now, we have no capability to do any of our own evaluations. Having an arm's length evaluation would be helpful at various times, and also when looking at membership to maintain the diverse membership from different sectors, different experience, people who are known to be maybe innovative, creative, looking at things in a different way, having Indigenous representation, not a token but adequate, equal representation there as well. So, questions?
All right, we have, we're already running a bit late, but we'll have some time for questions. Just keep in mind if you could keep things on time as much as possible. We'll begin with Graham.
Speaking in relation to recommendation number 2, which is on slide 8, how in your practice would the CQA refocus to upstream and deal with early intervention issues? We certainly know that this is an area for improvement, but how would, while you introduce that, would the CQA interface with child services?
I think similar to the other activities, it's a monitoring and reporting function, and I think the adage of what is measured is what's important really would bear some weight. So if there is a regular reporting on the activities, if it becomes one of the director's activities or one of the ministry's activities that they need to report on, if it's embedded in a standard, then there's the built-in accountability. And I think the ability to not just, the moving upstream, particularly in Indigenous communities, but not only, is really vital. So let's measure, let's report, let's have the oversight and the input.
And to, again, back to the legislation, to legitimize the council doing this kind of work, to include it into one of those mandate boxes somehow.
David?
Thank you both very much. Very pleased to hear more about the CQA, and my impression in the past is that it's been a reactive organization, that you're requested to do certain reviews in certain instances where there's crisis. I'm hearing you request a broader mandate to initiate and to have consistent, perhaps, approaches to quality, both from the, I guess, the clinical academic point of view, but also from the qualitative and subjective client service point of view, which is critical. So, am I correct in saying you want to be in legislation more directed as independent and to initiate quality assurance investigations as you need to, as well as to initiate policy proposals based on what the policy-wise research is suggesting?
I think that would be fair to say. I think we have been in some ways reactive, and in some ways we've been perhaps a little more proactive than they might have appreciated. But I think moving the dial on really wanting to capture the voices of the users of the system, the recommendation tracking, having the director report on on meeting the standards has changed. I mean, if you don't have our annual report out yet. I don't think it's out yet. Okay, so our this year's annual report, reporting on the standards, you'll see the standard related to contact, for example, is at a certain level, and the director took hold of that, and the change in contact, the required contact every 3 months or monthly types of contact that's required in the standard. Once the director took hold of that, the shift has been tectonic. So I think, again, what's measured, what's get publicly reported, somehow spurs the system on to, okay, we're going to focus on this, which is contact. There's other things, and they're adding things, and it's hard for us to take credit for things, but I think we need to take credit for some of those sorts of shifts that have taken place. The evaluation of the casework practice model that's underway, the work on the human resources side. I think our questions and our look into the system, our perspective has asked questions, and the response has been for the system, by and large. I'm not sure they love the poking and the prodding, but I think by and large the response has been very positive, and we've seen some real positive moves.
So they don't say, gee, thanks for that great idea, but they go back and they think about it, and then a year later we hear, oh yeah, they've started something. So we feel pretty good about what we've done.
Thank you.
Maria.
Thank you, Madam Chair. On slide 9, can you define oversight and explain how that may differ from the current quality assurance mandate? And is oversight an appropriate role for the internal body?
Well, I think words like working with the ministry to develop, implement, monitor, and evaluate are words that would be underneath an oversight umbrella. It's not oversight to a point of being an auditor, but I think it's oversight to the point of ensuring that the progress made is reported on, it's made public to the extent that it can be, that there is an internal but arm's length body that I wish I could have the thesaurus right now to look up some other words for oversight, but I think it does fall under that. I think in our mind, that umbrella of working with the system in the development, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation. So if there's a better word, we're open.
Okay, Madam Chair, I kind of have a second part, but if you look at slide 11, can you explain, or what do you mean by analyzing the data, and how would that differ from the current quality assurance mandate? And do you feel that you need to access, and what analysis needs to be led by CQA?
First of all, I think this wouldn't be a new, it's not necessarily new, or that we don't do it. We do have access to data, a lot of data. I think this is to ensure that the ability to access the data, to make sense of it, to track its understanding and how the data gets used in making evidence-based decisions is so that there's a response to the gaps and the trends that the data shows. I don't think this would necessarily be a new activity as much as we think it's important enough to ensure that it's there and it's that there's a enshrined in the legislation and the mandate so that it continues to happen.
Tyler.
Thank you, Chair. Just a quick question. I'm not as familiar with CQA as my other colleagues, but the presentation was very helpful and informative. As we know in Alberta, the infant mortality rates for First Nations in Alberta, are double those in non-First Nations. We know that as a fact. And looking at the matrix you have and the components you have, is there an Indigenous component to the structure that you have?
Are you talking the picture?
Yeah. So I guess that was sort of my first question. And then, again, I'm not sure how familiar it is with the accreditation process. So we've been accredited, our organization, for about 15 years. And so these were sort of national standards, and there really wasn't these unique factors taken into consideration. So we indigenized those standards. And so there was a First Nation standard as part of this. And that was very important to take into consideration all these unique situations and factors and settings. And so there was a major overhaul to that, So I'm wondering if that's something that's being looked at or being considered, and how is that being reflected, in your structure based on the data, which is, to me, unacceptable when we see these infant mortality rates.
Absolutely, yeah. So when we did the development of this graphic, we did also talk with First Nations youth who had been in the system, and also foster parents and kinship parents. So we talked with both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people who had been involved in the system. And from the council's perspective, the next step after this was to then take it back to communities and say, so what about this? How does this fit with you? And also with staff who are working across the system, so Indigenous and, in the CFSs and the Métis groups, and how does this fit for you? That this was not necessarily a finished product. Now we've passed it over, and people are starting to talk implementation, and we think there's a step missing, that we're recommending this step before it's implemented and everybody's trained and knows how to ask the questions, and we have criteria to measure, that it needs to be validated. And so I think that I'm glad you asked that question, because it just strengthens our first thought of that's what needs to happen next.
I would like to also, though, commend the development of Indigenous practice standards, Indigenous accreditation mechanisms and processes. If you go back to that 2010 external review of the child intervention system that was conducted by a national panel, and it does seem like putting panels together is one way to shift, to create a shift. But one of the recommendations out of that panel was that a few things, like perhaps a Indigenous Director of Child Welfare, Indigenous practice model, an ADM for Indigenous child welfare. And I think what ended up happening was the creation of an ADM, but it was in community engagement. But I think the trend towards these indigenizing standards, indigenizing practice models, looking at, and I'm sorry, Patty, I missed the earlier part of your presentation. I just got the question component. But I think that is clearly a way forward, that it's so that there is culturally relevant, geographically responsive approaches, and it isn't one size fits all either.
We've only got about 2 minutes left here that we can allow, and I've got a number of people wanting to ask questions, so please keep it as brief as possible. Rick, followed by Heather.
I just had the hook put on me here, so I'll try to cut it to the bare minimum here. Yeah, it's unfortunate you were only given half an hour and your presentation took that long, because I think we all have a little more to talk to you about. So I'm going to cut to the chase. I think the two of the big issues overriding all of this. When our committee is looking at making recommendations on how the system changes, one of the things that will probably come up when the CQA is being discussed is the redundancy and where do you fit in next to the child and youth advocate? Should they be reporting to you? Should you be reporting to them? Should you be a resource to them? I'm really interested in how you see that happening. And the other thing that the committee will be wrestling with, and it has to do with the Serenity's file that brought us here, is the timeliness of the reporting. So, give me your perspective if you don't mind. Are you slowing down the process? Is something else slowing down the process? Are you speeding up the process? Could you speed up the process if you had more information? Just anything along those lines. The redundancy and the timeliness. And I hate to cut it down to that because I got so many more questions, but as you just heard, I'm out of time.
So we do not slow down the process. We are waiting along with everyone else for the internal process to get the information, to write the histories, to get it to us, and that seems to take over a year. And that's a speeded up process. It used to take 2 years or longer or not at all. And so things are improving. I don't know how long the process takes today. It has been coming shorter and shorter all the time. When you say timeliness, we'd like you to put specifics on that. Like, I would think that an intern...
I've seen, listen, I'm not going to speak for we'll just say debates with the two numbers that keep coming back in 6 months and a year. Now, and you just mentioned the year is the speeded up process, and I guess, I won't speak authoritatively for my colleagues on the panel here. I think a year is what a lot of us are thinking is the longest it should take, not the shortest.
I think that's the longest for the advocate. I think that internally they should do a review a lot faster. I think it should happen right away. I think it should happen... if a report of death comes in and there's alarming things in the report of death, I think that it should happen within 3 or 4 weeks, that there should be, somebody looking at it, whether it's internal, and it should be looked at right away. And one of the files that we did look at right away with Minister Bular back in the day, we got the files, and within 5 days, we went through all the files, a group of 3 of us, and came out with what are the concerns and, what happened here. So it can happen fast, but you need dedicated people, and all the people that are doing this right now have other jobs, they have other responsibilities. So there's not I don't know if there's dedicated people. So we don't slow it down. Are we duplication? No. Right now the advocate is external. We're still internal, working with the system internally. We still think that there's a place for both. We still think that there is some advantage to being internal arm's length. Arm's length does give you some independence, gives more transparency because we can report on certain things, and
bound by, you know, an employer-employee relationship. Being internal, though, means we do have access, or we should have access to information that external people aren't given right away. So being internal could mean that it could be more timely if we were a part of the internal review from the beginning. And if it, you know, I've said to them 4 months, should be 4 months, and they keep pushing back, oh no, it can't be more than 6. So I don't, you know, and I don't know their issues of why it can't be faster. If it's staffing, is it, like they've got the files, you know, they've got the files, right? Somebody dies, there's the file. And so it's not like you have to wait for the file, it's there. And so why can't it start right away? Like, why aren't there dedicated staff to do this kind of work? Again, you asked, is it a redundancy? Quality assurance councils, even without the desk is a tool for quality assurance, reviewing those files. But there's all the other things that it does. When you go online and look at quality assurance, every organization, every business, every school, every health region, all has quality assurance councils looking at, you know, what's going good, what went wrong, what's best practice, and it's continual improvement. You do something, you think it's great, but you know, how can you tweak it? How can you make it a little bit better? How can this be better for a client? How can this be better for the family? So it's a continual process that's necessary regardless of deaths or not. It needs a quality assurance council. The deaths are a tool. Reviewing the death files are a tool to find out more information.
Well, okay.
And can I just say one thing, because I know you're going to cut us off because we're late. If you write our questions, we would be happy to write down answers and send that to you, so you'll have answers for any questions that you have.
Thank you. Heather on the phone?
That was a good answer.
Can you hear me?
Hello? Really loud. There we are.
Hello?
Yes, we hear you.
Hello?
We hear you.
I don't know if you can hear me, but I'll ask the question anyway and see. Basically, I'm just wondering if we're looking at supporting our family focus and our child-centered practice, and looking at the fact that we're trying to do, you know, family being self-determinants and being motivated on themselves. When I hear a recommendation around slowing down, becoming more intrusive with families, and or when we look at closing files, if we close, having involvement for up to a year after to do evaluation, I guess the question that comes up for me is, when our practice is to be driven to support families to become independent and to be least intrusive, meaning being less involved, how does that fit into how the act is written and how the frontline workers are doing their practice? Because I feel like it's a little bit counterintuitive to the work and the intent of the practice that the legislation is written. I'm not sure if that makes sense.
I'll take a stab at responding. I think if we look at those family-focused and family move towards independence, it needs to be progressive and careful and thoughtful and aligned. I think the in and out, the door going in and out, the opening and closing and opening and closing is way more destructive. I think the ability to create a partnership with the worker, with the social worker, with the system, to be able to view the system as it's intended, as offering help, support, as offering a way to be successful, needs to so I'd be very careful about worrying about being overly intrusive. I would think it's important to form really collaborative working relationships, and that relationship is based on trust and honesty and respect, and that the worker is available, that there's a sense that they can turn to that person for help, that the system becomes part of a healing process, not a hammer, it's definitely a culture change of the way of work, and that's what's described in those work models. But closing too quickly or walking away too fast doesn't walk the path with the family.
Bruce, really
I appreciate what you're saying. So I did frontline for 13 years as a child protection worker. And so I guess my pushback on that would be the responsibility of the government is to be involved with the family when you have to be intrusive. The intent of working with our community partners and our resources that are within the centers or within, towns, cities, all those things, is that the government worker, the caseworker, has a responsibility to build capacity in the community so that the government doesn't have to be involved with these families. So for me, I guess, again, I struggle and I question around how we look at the casework practice, because that work is what is happening, because the caseworkers don't want to have the files open if they can support the family through other community resources. So how do you see that working in a recommendation when it can't just be a focus on the legislation and the casework file? It has to be looking at the whole community and the collaboration model.
I totally agree. And I think part of that collaboration model is to ensure that that plan to if you will, hand it over to or entrust the community resources to pick up the support part, the part that helps the family develop their own capacities, but to ensure that that transfer and transition is planned for, and that there's still some accountability, I believe. I think that the deaths in Syria, the deaths that we've seen resulting from a family agreeing to seek help or get addictions counseling, get mental health interventions, work with a community agency, and then the file is closed, but there's just the family's agreed to do it. There's no demonstration that the family has actually done it. There's no confirmation back to the community resource that they've stuck with the plan, and then the file is opened in another 6 months, 9 months, 2 years. They're back where they were to begin with. And I think it's that transition period where a better partnership with the community resources would enable, I think, that family to hopefully stay healthy.
And just one comment about the families with multiple complex issues and addictions being one of them, agreeing to go to an addiction service when there's a long history, maybe personal trauma, maybe intergenerational trauma, addiction for many, many years, and agreeing to go to a 6-week program is not going to change anything. And so to expect that that's going to be a checkoff that a file can be closed, even with the community resources trying to fix it, it's just not going to happen. So maybe there, mental health services, addiction services, those need to be looked at too, because what is out there isn't just helping the people with the long-standing problems.
I also think, and I love that word reconciliation, I think if you're going to look at the action part of the reconciliation, that you need to walk this journey with those families, not leave them to their, yes, you've got to, they have to be able to, you want to build their capacity. But especially the complex cases, we've recommended some way of being able to flag families where there is the intergenerational trauma, where you have kids growing up in the system, having kids that are growing up in the system, having kids growing up in the system. Well, where are you going to break that cycle? How are you going to break that cycle? And it's not by opening and closing files.
All right, this is the last question. Bruce, really quickly, please.
Got you. I'm going to defer one for...
Fair enough. Yeah.
So on slide 10, you talked about recommendations going forward. One talks about the role of the council in the internal reviews. You've talked about it a little bit, building on Rick's question. So one of the things going forward would be if you could kind of flesh out your ideas about what your role could be, how it would be distinct now, what's different now compared to 2010, how should it or could it be different? And if a quick answer now, or you can defer that to later. The second part of it would be looking at legislation that's required to clarify that role. Do you have any clear ideas at this point what legislation changes you'd recommend that would be helpful in promoting that change?
Well, I'll start, and I know Donna will have something to say. So when we first became into place, there really wasn't a systematic internal review of death or serious injury, which is why the council, and it was in our legislation that we were required to do it, they created this report and review committee to review the deaths, hoping to be able to pass that over to an internal, once there was a systematic internal process established. There is the process established. I actually don't think that they've completed one yet. We think that there is a role for a subset of council, much like there's the report and review committee is a small committee of council, to be part of that internal death review, to sit at that table and be part of it.
The value of the multidisciplinary group looking at those files, it's fascinating. I pick out all the health things when we report them back to the stat director or the manager who's doing that work. Often that hasn't even been picked up by anybody, the health things. The policemen on our group will pick up different kinds of things. Well, was this review done, or was this investigated? What was the answer of that? And those haven't been picked up. So having that multidisciplinary look at the files is very, very valuable. And so having participation in the internal quality assurance review process of, contributing to their terms of reference like we do to the advocates, seeing the reports come back, asking questions about the reports. Well, did you look at this? Did you look at that? Just having touch points where we could be involved, because this is not a job for us. This is a council providing, recommendations and advice based on our experience from all different kind of areas. So that's how I see it. And for the legislation, I don't think we've looked at where the words need to be different. All the points that we've had here, we could look at that if you wanted us to, and take a stab at that.
Okay. So I want to say thank you very much to Donna and Gayla for your presentation. Really appreciate that. And we now need to move on to our next presenter, and we're already, I do apologize, we're about a half hour behind, so we're going to have to work hard to kind of get caught up and maybe do a working lunch. Yes. Yes, absolutely. So we're working on it. So I would like to invite from the Office of the Child and Youth Advocate, Del Graff, who's going to speak with us. And we do have the lunch break scheduled at 12, so we'll be moving a little bit into that, but we'll do the best we can.
think I got it. This is stuff you sent at 8:30 this morning I didn't have because I was already on the way down. Yeah. Thank you. That's the problem. No, this stuff, there's one where why we didn't have the stuff, but we just sent it at 8:30 this morning.
That's true.
Thank you.
Yeah. You know what's best for you guys.
Thank you.
You got your question answered, Rick?
Well,
I don't think you got your question answered, did you?
as well as they could in the time allotted. I mean, I thought they did a good job actually with a little bit of.
I don't know about their approach. I'm skeptical about their approach. We'll see what first is.
Oh yeah. Okay.
That attitude of well, we know what's best for you guys. You know,
That'll
never work.
That never flies, what you say.
Take it away, Del.
Well, good morning. My name is Del Graff. I'm the Child and Youth Advocate for the province, and I'm joined by Randy Baker, who's our Director of Engagement and Education. We're going to be providing a presentation over the next, I believe, 45 minutes we have.
Well, I say I've got 30 minutes for the presentation, 30 minutes for questions, but if you're 45 minutes, go for it. We'll work it out.
Okay.
Everybody will talk fast.
Fair enough. Thank you very much. And I would like to thank you for the opportunity to spend some time with you. You know, the work that you have to do as a panel is so important. I want to acknowledge that we're on Treaty 6 traditional territory. I do that because it's important to me that I pay respects to the people who were here before us. We've listened to Indigenous children, youth, parents, elders, and many others throughout the province. They told us about their experience with the child welfare system and their hopes for the system into the future. Theirs are the voices for change that we feel honored to bring before you this morning. What we heard from every corner of this province is that change must happen, and it must happen now. Throughout this presentation, we'd extend an invitation to you to hear what Indigenous Albertans have had to say to us and to consider their voices in light of the important decisions that are before you. Today we'll talk about the overrepresentation of Indigenous young people in child welfare. We'll provide some background about what led us to develop this special report. We'll show you a video that's approximately 12 minutes in length that highlights some of what we heard. We'll talk about our process, and we'll go through the recommendations that are arising from the special report. I should mention that when we completed the special report, we used the term Aboriginal, and since then we have shifted our terminology to use the term Indigenous. And so you'll see that in the report, the terms that we use, and in my language I will use a different term, but I mean similar things. As well, we also use the term child welfare. And you'll see in some of the information that there's the term child intervention. When we spoke to Indigenous people throughout the province, they referred us to child welfare as being the term that they understood better than child intervention. It was interesting because the term that the government chose is child intervention. So I would just keep track of those two caveats. Alberta has the third highest Indigenous population in Canada, and the highest Métis population in the country. 1 in 10 children in Alberta are Indigenous. That's an important statistic to keep track of, and we're going to be speaking more about that. Almost 70% of Alberta's children in care are Indigenous. In fact, the actual number is just over 69%. When we looked at indexing the number of children in care, and we put it to a per thousand level of children. So for every 1,000 non-Indigenous children, we would find that about 3 of them would be in government care. For every 1,000 Métis children, about 18 would be in government care. And for every 1,000 First Nations children, about 94 were in care. That's part of what overrepresentation looks like in this province. The other thing that we found is that the more intrusive that government is regarding child intervention, the more disproportionate the numbers get. So for example, for those children who are receiving child intervention services but are remaining in their home, they've not been taken into care, about 40% of those young people are Indigenous. Remember, their population proportion is 10%. When we look at the proportion of children that are in temporary care, and temporary care is where there is still efforts being made to return them to their families, about 55% of those children are Indigenous. And by the time we get to children who are in permanent care, that's the point where government has severed their legal ties to parents. That proportion goes up to 75%. So 3 out of every 4 children who are in permanent care in government are Indigenous. The overrepresentation of Indigenous young people in Alberta is among the highest in Canada and has to be considered unacceptable by anybody's standards. We must do better than this. We're not alone in the calls for change. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, you would all, I think, be familiar with it, had 94 calls to action. The first 5 calls to action were related to child welfare. Justice Sinclair, who's now Senator Sinclair, explained to us that those first 5 were there for a very good reason, because they were the most urgent in need of change. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People was endorsed by Alberta in 2015. And I hope that you're familiar with the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal ruling that resulted in a decision that First Nations children were being discriminated against in relation to child welfare service. Finally, I wanted to just mention a court decision that's called the Daniels decision, and it's a decision that is related to Métis rights. And that decision said that the federal government has responsibility to negotiate and to consult with Métis people. That in fact they owe a fiduciary responsibility to them in that regard, and that Métis are considered Indians under the Constitution Act of 1867. The impact of that has not been fully felt yet, but it is a significant event that is part of the current calls to change. When we looked at our special report, we identified 3 purposes: to improve Aboriginal children's and families' experiences and outcomes with child intervention, to push Aboriginal child intervention to a greater level of practice excellence, and to collectively influence government and others to change their relationships with First Nations and communities peoples regarding child intervention. Before we undertook this report, we went around the province and we asked stakeholders, specifically regions, DFNAs, and other groups, what they saw as most important for a special report by my office. We have the mandate to provide special reports, and we had done one on young people aging out of care. The overwhelming commentary about what was important for a special report was the overrepresentation of Aboriginal children in care. So we want to show you a short video, it's about 12 minutes long, that highlights some of what we heard. I'm hopeful that when I just click over like this, and I try to click again, it should work. So we have no sound.
We need our sound.
They're coming to help you.
Thank you.
This is where you talk amongst yourselves and we'll get things going.
Is it available online?
Yeah, it is on our website.
It's on your website?
Yeah.
We can run from your website, yeah. What's the name?
Working here?
No.
We can play from there. You can go directly to the website. It's just be coming through room volume, so it's not on my end.
This is the Meeple website, right? Video? No, it's just embedded.
Tell them where it is on the website. Do you want to go there?
Yeah.
Yep, just I think go to the website. Sure. Do we do it here? Yeah. Sure. Just click there and hit start. So they'd be completely off the website.
Here we go.
Joku kehä kihtsei taua avasis kani tauket ihmi kuusi iskuero tantsim namasut kita ajaku namasut utsavaasimessa kani tauki tautse evonehan hetta maskami utsavaasimessa ahpaneukko.
My mother struggled with addictions her entire life. Having been raised in the child welfare system, I think that's what led to the unstableness in her life and having addictions to both alcohol and drugs.
I remember growing up, my parents would drink a lot. Sometimes they would barricade the hallway so that we wouldn't be able to get out while they were having a party or something.
I was in and out of foster care growing up because problems happened. My dad was a wonderful man, don't get me wrong, but he was an alcoholic. He drank lots and he'd sometimes beat my stepmom in front of me and my older brother. When you grow up with your mom partying and whatnot and your dad like that, you just tend to try to forget the bad things in it, and so I try to block that all out and just remember the good times I had.
Well, I think it's time for us to take a serious look at what we provide for services to First Nations and Métis children and their families when it comes to child welfare.
The separation from our mother was really, really difficult because we had a lot of pain thinking that we were abandoned or we were unwanted. It was difficult to understand as a child why you couldn't be with your family.
The first time I was brought into care, I was 5. Being taken away from your home and everything feels terrible. That's all you ever knew and everything, and now you're being transported to an alien country, something very foreign. Those kind of memories are very traumatic, so they stay with you longer.
Once you remove a child from their natural environment, it's very traumatizing for them because now that they're looking at shifting their whole lifestyle and to try and adapt to a new way of life. And just for various reasons, it's very difficult for them to do that.
Getting separated from my siblings. When I first got taken into care, I wanted to be with them. I really did. I didn't want to leave them because, I was the older brother and it's kind of my responsibility to watch over them. But I wasn't really given a chance or a choice. So getting separated from them was really scary. It wasn't fun. It was really thought I'd never get to see them again, which was scary.
Well, I think when children come into care, they have to maintain contact with their family. There has to be someone that they can talk to, someone that can maybe visit them, whether it's a grandmother or a grandfather or an aunt or an uncle.
It was hard being away from my family. When I was first in care, I didn't talk to any of my family for about a month and a half. And just, being
basically cut off from them. It was hard.
When I was 16, I realized I had rights to visit my family. I discovered through a book that told me all my rights as a foster child. It just made me very upset with the system, my social workers, because there were many, and my foster mother, because I felt like as a foster child, when you have family, you should be able to connect. That's time with my family that I could have had those connections with growing up.
To me, it is really important to stay connected. The other important thing is identity. Those little children need to be proud. They need to be proud. They have to have that sense of something in there.
The impacts of residential school, for instance, there's very few positives. And it's like a cancer, a disease. It's like for 100 years of damage, it takes about another 100 years to really treat something that's really untreatable or takes a long time.
It's difficult to stop the intergenerational cycle that is continuing to this day, from colonization to residential schools, and the child welfare system is just a modern day residential school.
The secure unit that I was in, you couldn't even step outside. It was, doors were locked all the time. You had to ask to go and use the bathroom. The only time you'd be let outside, it would be in a fenced area, and there would be 1 or 2 staff with you at all times. These children are so locked in. They don't have that freedom to live like a child, like a healthy child. There's a fear that if you're a foster kid, you cannot make friends with children who are not in care. They are not allowed to go and stay at their friend's house or go somewhere unless the whole family has criminal check.
The child welfare system can keep children physically safe. The problem is we can pay attention to the physical safety of a child and disregard the mental and the emotional and the spiritual safety of that child just by what we do to create physical safety. And physical safety is critically important. I wouldn't want to negate that. But if we don't pay attention to those other things, we're harming a child too.
I have 3 girls and 2 boys, from 10 to 17. The mother of my children, we were together at the time when they were taken. Due to addictions and extracurricular activities. While the kids were in care, they had divulged a little bit of information about the treatment that they were going through, and it kind of scared me. I actually had them placed in different homes twice due to drug use, due to violence, physical violence. Do they even know where they're putting our children? I mean, they're designed to help families, and yet they would put kids in danger unknowingly, but I mean, they're doing the same thing. If anything, they made things a little bit worse.
The purpose of child welfare is to make sure the child is safe. And that's what they did for me and my brothers and sisters. But there should also be efforts to keep the children within the community rather than completely removing the child from the community, the culture, their family.
I think for any child who's been, taken off the reserve and away from their family, to be put into a foster home or group home in a city or something like that, I know it's hard on them. They're just alone and afraid, and it's not right.
We often hear about how we want to make the necessary changes, how we want to change policy, how we want to make that difference in the lives of our young people and children. But sometimes we fail to realize that we have to ask them what they want, how they want to live.
I've seen miracles happen with proper mentoring and understanding and making someone feel like self-worth. That's what I would want for these kids.
I have a great relationship with my kids now. Now that they're in a stable environment, you know, after so long. Their future looks promising. There's a lot of work to do. It's apparent how damaged, I guess, they are. But I'm hopeful. I've got a good support network now, and we're getting them the help that they need. The cool thing is that this time they know that I'm going to be there when it's over.
I want to see strong Aboriginal involvement. The way it's been for the last 20 years, if you go back 20 years when they were talking about the redesign of children's services to be built on the 4 pillars, one of the pillars was Aboriginal involvement. And it didn't take long for that pillar to crumble. And over the last 15 years or so, we've sort of been tolerated, humored, ignored, but we were never given full involvement into looking after our children and making decisions on our children.
If I could change one thing, it'd have to be keep the kids together. Honestly, like, we were a big family. There was like 7 of us, but like, I really wanted to be with my little brothers and sisters and be the big brother I was supposed to be. Getting separated from them is really lonely. Not for me, but also probably for them. And it caused a lot of problems later in life because I didn't really know how to act when I saw them again.
Listen to them. Their voice matters. Only they know what they're feeling, right? They might not be able to express that in words, but if you listen, you'll hear it.
Government doesn't create change. Government reacts to change. And change is created by communities who say enough. Who say we've had more than enough. It's time to make a difference now, and we demand change, and then governments will take action. This is not an Aboriginal people's issue. This is a Canadian issue. This is an Alberta's issue. And it really is our issue because these are our friends and our neighbors and our community members, and they're people that if we stay connected to each other, we can make a positive difference collectively. The time is now to come to a table without the preconceived notions about what will work for these children and families, and to hear what they have to say, and to pay attention to it, and to make the changes that are needed.
I'll now ask Randy Baker to provide some information about how the process that we undertook to get to this point.
Thank you. I'm going to go through some statistics, and often we think of those as kind of dry, but I want you to remember as we go through these that they represent people and they represent their voices. I want to take just a minute to share a story, because I think we all have moments in time where something impacts us. And I know one of those for me was in March 2012. I was working with Human Services at the time, and I was at a community conversation with the Indigenous community down in Lethbridge. And at the end of the meeting, the floor was open for comments, and this one lady, and I believe she was from the Blood Tribe, stood up and made a comment that has stuck with me ever since. I could take you to where she was standing in the room. And she said to the system, she said, "You keep taking our children because you say we're not meeting your standards, and you keep putting them in places that aren't meeting our standards." And that, to me, encapsulated that, and that I spent much of 2.5 years of my life doing this report, and that comment has stuck with me throughout that time and to this day. And so I'll talk a bit about what we did. When we did the report, we wanted to go out and meet with and hear from people. And we did. We heard from almost 750 people around the province. The graph illustrates how we heard. As you can see, we had a lot of phone surveys, 3 of them. We had our survey online, and we did some one-to-one interviews, but the bulk of what we did was we held focus groups around the province and we met with people, and we heard through that process from 620 people about this issue. If you look at this graph, it's a breakdown of those focus groups. So 29 of them were just young people, and these were all young people who were involved with the system, whose lives had been touched by child intervention. We did 14 groups with various caregivers, 21 with stakeholders, 15 mixed ones, so we had a variety of people there, and 6 with elders. And the importance of the elders one for me is that that's what we started with. Our first focus group was in January 2015, and we met with a group of elders to ask them, really, not to say, but to ask, how do we go about this? What are some things we need to pay attention to? Do these questions make sense? So we did that to start the process. Here, we wanted to be representative. When we look at hearing people's voices, this is where we went. I went to many of those places personally. We really tried to cover the province to hear from people, and we did that. But we also heard, was so instructive for me is that we heard the same story over and over again in all those different places. One of the other things that we did, where we heard from an additional 214 people, was prior to us undertaking the report, Del met with the chiefs and he met with the Métis Nation, and he really said, is this something you want us to do? They agreed, and they said, yes, we need to hear what our young people are saying. We need to hear about the impacts. One of the commitments we made as an office was that once we had gathered information, that we would come back to them with our recommendations. So that's what we did. We did this in the spring of 2016, and so we met with Treaty 6, Treaty 7, Treaty 8, and the Métis Nation, and again, we did that in various parts of the province. But we took our draft recommendations to them in a form and said, here's what we've come up with. Does it reflect what you're hearing? Does it reflect your experience? And so we ended up, we tweaked to come up with our final recommendations, but we wanted, again, to honor the voices of the people who shared with us. And this quote is in our report. Such a high percentage of Aboriginal children in care, all with the same abilities and strength as any other culture, but they've had power taken away from them. And I think what's important to recognize is that in spite of all the challenges faced by young people, families, and communities, there was a strength and resiliency that came through in the stories that we heard. The Indigenous community was incredibly generous in their willingness to contribute to what we were doing, and they did so with kindness and care. And I think it would do all of us well to recognize the contributions that they make in our society. They're our neighbors, they're our friends, they're part of Alberta, and we need to help them. And so I'm going to turn it back to Del to talk about the recommendations.
Thank you, Randy. As I go through the recommendations, I would like to invite you to keep something in mind that we heard over and over again from participants in the information gathering that we did. Whether it was young people, their parents, elders, or caregivers. They had one or another version of this question: will this report make a difference this time? We heard that almost everywhere we went. The 4 areas of recommendations that we're going to speak to relate to governance, resources, services, and accountability. One of the first things that we talk about is a new relationship with Aboriginal communities based on increased levels of self-determination and support, and we outline some of the areas where we think that those are critically important. One of the things that I've spoken to before is the type of relationship that historically has occurred between government and Indigenous people. And I refer to it as a dominion-over relationship. And that's a relationship where, Patty and I could be partners, and we could be considered equal partners until it comes time where we disagree. Then if I'm the government, my word counts more than her word. And that's a dominion over type of relationship. Relationships have got to change for change to really, really happen for people. You can see the other areas that we've listed in under this recommendation. You've got a copy of the report. We think that it's important that there be resources and support for Aboriginal communities to ensure a full range of services, from prevention through intervention and aftercare. We also think that it's critically important that there be band registration for First Nations children and Métis citizenship registration for Métis children. One of the things that you might remember in the video was Elder Eva Cardinal talking about identity and about the importance of that. One of the ways that we can ensure that young people know where they belong is with the registration that comes with them being a First Nations child or a Métis child. We also speak to the adoption of Jordan's principle, and I know that there has been some work in that regard, and I do want to acknowledge that that's in fact where I'd heard of your newest member, Tyler White, was with respect to the work that's being done on Jordan's principle. It's so important that Jordan's principle be adopted fully by our province. In program and service delivery, we think that and we heard that there needs to be a strength-based approach that reduces risk to child safety and well-being, but that needs to take place within an Indigenous context. We also talk, and I heard Gayla Rogers speak about a statutory services director that had been recommended before. We speak about the establishment of an Aboriginal authority for statutory services. We're not specific about what that can look like, but we do recognize that there is not sufficient authority within this current system for Indigenous people to have their voices heard effectively by those with decision-making responsibility. There are many ways to have a statutory services authority. We believe that it's important to look at adopting practice standards that are consistent with the interests of Aboriginal people. Years ago, there was First Nations practice standards. I'm not sure if some of you have heard of them, but they had been adopted by a number of groups across the province. In fact, there are still some delegated First Nations agencies that are using them on a day-to-day basis to deal with the children who are in their care. We also speak to the importance of children in care maintaining important relationships with special considerations for siblings. When we heard from young people that sibling relationship was so important to them. One of the young people that you'd recall on the video was the young fella. His name is Tyree. Tyree is graduating this year. But one of the things that he wanted was to be the big brother that he thought he should be. And I can tell you that today, Tyree goes and he meets with his siblings every couple of weeks, every 2 or 3 weeks, and he takes them out for an outing because of that important thing that he wants to do, is to be the big brother he was meant to be. Not all of the stories that we heard are tragic and sad and like that. Tyree has made a huge progress in his life. And that's important, that sibling relationship. We also speak to increasing the use and resources for kinship care. Kinship care has been a big topic in this province. When we were doing this report, we recognized that kinship care did not receive the same level of support as other forms of care, and we believe that it needs to. Not just compensation support, but training support, capacity support, all of those things. In many ways, and we've written about this before, kinship care can have complexities that foster care does not have. And finally, we speak to improving communications with Aboriginal children who are involved with the child welfare system. What we would hear over and over again was that young people would be in the system, and many of them had been involved with the system for years, and they had not ever been told why they were in care, or had been misinformed about why they were in care. And so over and over we would hear that it's important to tell them at an age, at a level that they can comprehend, the reasons that they were brought into care and the reasons that they remain in care. When we speak about outcomes and accountability, we've made 2 recommendations. One is that in partnership with Indigenous stakeholders, there is a multi-year plan to address the overrepresentation of Indigenous children in child welfare, and that there be progress reported annually. The other is to monitor, evaluate, and report regularly to the Legislative Assembly on the state of Aboriginal children in our province. One of the things that one of the reporters wrote when we were releasing this report is, how will we know if there's progress if we're not willing to look? These 2 recommendations around accountability are all about being willing to look. And we have to be willing to look. At the end of the video, you saw this statement by Elder Charles Wood from Satellite Cree Nation. Our hope is that a new story is created for Aboriginal young people and their families involved with the child intervention system. That statement guided our work. It guides our presentation to you. It guides the presentations that we've done. We're doing one, some of our staff are doing one this morning in a southern community. We've done this presentation or a version of that over and over because we want to have a new story created. We know that it will take time. In my view, if we can look back 10 years from now and say, hey, the story has changed for Indigenous children. It is not the same as it was. That progress, we're seeing it, and we're seeing it in real terms, and they're telling us about it. In 10 years' time, if we can say that, then we've succeeded in doing what we had hoped to do. Then this panel has succeeded in what we hope that you'll do. And this province has succeeded in what we hope the province will do. So on that note, I'll thank you very much for listening as long as you have. And if there are questions, Randy and I would be welcome. Would welcome them.
Yes, we've got lots of questions. I'll start with David.
Thank you very much, both of you, for a very impassioned and timely update on one of the areas that we